Hello, I'm Katie, and this is the Free Art and Design School podcast slash web series slash whatever. And today we have another guest talking about their educational journey. So if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Lashan. I've been a designer for a very long time. I think we'll say plus years at this point.
Oh my
But let's be
God.
real, I've been doing it since even before that, just for fun, right? Just as a person that likes to make things. Um, I think the uh, quick intro, I guess, is, I run a design studio today, but my journey has taken me from, working at tech startups to working at agencies to, working in-house at music festivals or magazine shops or whatever it is, just all over the place. Uh, and the design work that, I started in, was again started more the graphic design, print design, things like that. And then as our world has changed over the last 15 years, navigating more and more into kind of the digital space and what that looks like now today.
What sort of got you into design in the first place? Like, were you really into it as a kid? Were you like an artist, comic book kind of person, or just like fell into it?
I think I got into capital D design when I was at like a friend's birthday party or something. And this was a very long time ago. This is like early 2000s. And we were all playing Halo on the Xbox because
Mhm.
that's what you do in
Of
the early
course.
2000s. And there was one guy on the computer doing something, and I was like, "Oh, that looks really cool." And like, during my time when I wasn't playing, I looked over and I was like, "What is he doing?" And lo and behold, I discovered Photoshop, and I was like, "That's really sick. I want to learn how to do that." Uh,
Oh my
and
God.
then the rest is history, I guess. Right?
Wow, that's like insane to think about. Um, So yeah, I'm not of the Photoshop. I feel like there's like Photoshop designers and then like Illustrator designers, and I taught a Photoshop class at school, like I was the TA, but never my thing of choice. And I feel like when you started Photoshop, it must have been like way more bare
It
bones than it is
was
now.
Yeah, I think I started on Photoshop version 7,
Okay.
which yeah, I remember it's like the one that has like it loads up and there's like an eyeball like as the splash screen. I
Oh
remember
my
that.
God.
Yeah.
So were you interested in like posters or websites or like what sort of like how did that transition into a design journey for you?
I think the way I looked at it was I would see things um like on the internet or just in real life, and I'd look at them and be like, oh, that's so cool. I wonder how they did that. Like I
Yeah.
wonder how they made that like lion look like it's like jumping out of a whatever, doing something. And then again seeing this other friend kind of sit there and make those changes like right in front of my face and really showed me that wow, this is like a really cool thing to learn how to do, right? So I think I started getting into it that way. Was like, I want to learn how to just recreate the stuff around me. Because I think that's one of the things like they maybe don't tell you in design school is like it's half the work of being a designer is like having good taste and like being like, oh yeah, like this looks good and I'm gonna try to like replicate that or like learn from this thing that makes me feel a certain way.
Yeah. And I actually
Yeah.
don't think you can teach that. I think you have to like
Yeah.
train yourself to do that and then like see what other people are enjoying and then they kind of reverse engineer it. But yeah, that's
For
like a
sure.
total out the wall, out the window discussion, which is sad because you're supposed to in design school, I guess, and I guess we can talk more about that in a bit, like how different design school versus the real world is. Like you're sort of presenting work and then designers have their own, opinions on what's good or beautiful or interesting. And normally those are based on how old they are, like the sort of culture they're from, their background. And none of
Mhm.
that is a kind of inherent truth, which is then really difficult if you're a student and you're like presenting work from your perspective and then it's getting shot down totally because of like some sort of arbitrary aesthetic determination. So I feel like
Totally.
it's maybe better to hone your aesthetic tastes outside of school.
Yeah, and I think that's really like interesting for me again because for context, like I didn't go to school for design. It was just something I purely did just for fun. Like I said, like at a birthday party, watching someone do Photoshop and being like, "That's sick. I want to get into that." Um, so I know for me, like a lot of the stuff I did for fun, was like me sitting at home by myself, after school or whatever it was, and being like, oh, let me like poke around and see what I can do. And then sure, maybe every now and then I would like show one of my friends and be like, oh, look at this cool thing I made. But it wasn't necessarily like talking to other designers, right?
Yeah,
And being like, hey, what do you think? Do you have feedback? Do you have critique?
right.
Which I think maybe gave me a different approach to like it allowed me to like develop my taste and develop like the way I worked. Where I finally got to a place where I was able to stand on my own two legs and like show something to a client and they could tell me something and I wouldn't be like completely destroyed by it,
Yeah, definitely. I feel like having thick skin is like the most important thing in the business.
Yeah, and I think see that's such an interesting thing. Like I've never really thought that I've had thick skin. I feel like I'm actually pretty sensitive to how people like react to things. But I think what it's really more about is like almost like distancing yourself from the work. Like knowing that if someone is saying something about what you made, they're not, critiquing you, they're critiquing the work, right? Like
Yeah,
you are not your work, kind of like that kind of idea.
definitely.
I think that took me a long time to really like understand and be like, okay, it's okay that my, creative director is saying this thing and blah 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 and wants these changes, and then like the client wants something else, and this other junior designer is like complaining about this other thing. Like we're just trying to make this thing better, and like
Yeah.
that's the goal. It's not about me. I just happen to be the hands that are pushing the buttons to make it happen, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, it's good to have like
Yeah,
self-love and respect over your work. I don't know. It's
right.
the thing I phrased it as in school was taking things to heart, but not taking things personally. Like
Yeah,
accepting, criticism, knowing that it's about the thing that I'm creating and not about my personal taste or aesthetic.
yeah.
Um, but I don't know. It was very hard for me to learn those lessons.
But I think it's like when you talk about like personal taste and aesthetic, like that's taken me a very long time to actually like know what that is and what that looks like, and then being like okay with it and being like, this is just like the way I like to create things. Like when I make a logo or do like a branding thing, for a client, like I kind of lead with it where I'm like, hey, like let me show you some other, work that we've done for other products or, businesses like yours. And then it clicks in their head like, oh, okay, he does this kind of style, he does this kind of aesthetic. Like that's the kind of stuff that he focuses in on. And again, it's taken me like a long time to be like, oh yeah, this is what it is, and I feel comfortable just doing that. I don't
Yeah,
need to be everything for everyone, kind of
right.
thing.
Yeah. It's kind of like being a tattoo artist where like they have very
Mm,
specific styles and you seek out the kind of artist that you're interested in and you certainly wouldn't really want to go to an artist who could do everything or I mean I guess that is fine but like I think the people who are generally more sought after in contemporary times are the ones who have like a honed focus. But I actually think part of that is driven by social media more than anything else. I think
totally.
you
Yeah,
have experts in general, but the way that the Instagram grid has created contemporary society in the creative fields is kind of insane to me.
yeah, yeah. I think yeah, it's really interesting to me to think about that because I like for my studio, like I don't do any marketing. I don't really like have an Instagram account that I'm like actively running and posting our work or doing anything like that. But funny enough, like the work still shows up, right?
Sure.
And I think that approach of like, hey, we did some work for one client and they really loved working with us, and someone else finds out through them, and like that kind of word of mouth kind of approach, it I feel like it ultimately is the thing that social media is trying to like replicate, but like it's just turned into this thing where it's like, you have an algorithm behind that and whatever, and not just, hey, I just met a guy at like a party and they were like, oh my gosh, you have to do our branding for this thing or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think
And
it's just seeing like that. It is the same, but just more amplified, right?
yeah. And it
Yeah,
doesn't feel as sort of serendipitous, right? Like social media is never going to capture the word of mouth kind of like energy, which I guess is good for people who are introverts and like bad at that, bad at like interacting with people and just kind of want to have like
yeah,
their account that they can hide behind. And I don't think that's a bad thing either. I think that's actually great um for people who are more oriented like that. But I don't know. It's I don't know what design would look like if we didn't have Instagram. which is a
Mm.
kind of insane thing to think. Like, what would 2023 look like in terms of design and marketing if we didn't have social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could tell you it's I remember that time.
Well, I know, but
Back
what if
then.
that had evolved? Like, where would we be now?
Yeah, no, it's funny. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think, what did I do back then? Because I feel like back then there were just like specific like design blogs that everyone went on,
Mm,
you
yeah,
know, and like those specific bloggers would just like feature other people's designs. So you could like send it to them and be like, hey, like, you want to feature me, blah 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 kind of thing. And like you end up showing up in their like weekly, like, amazing design inspiration
yeah,
kind of posts. And I think, yeah, the moment like, you know, like Pinterest and Instagram and like all of those things started popping up, then it started to be like, oh well, now you're just going to post it yourself, and then hopefully it'll kind of show up somewhere. But
yeah,
I think I really like those kind of smaller communities that existed back then, because it did feel more like, oh yeah, like, this guy, like you like read his blog every week or whatever, and you see the stuff that he's talking about, and then you get to comment and like interact and all that. But again, it's like a more hyper localized
right.
kind of experience.
Yeah,
Uh,
and certainly not like capitalist driven or like driven in the same way that the algorithm drives like ads
so,
and content. My the letterpress company I worked for started as a Tumblr page 15 years ago, and I like when I found that out, I literally couldn't understand how that would be possible, how something would go from being a personal blog to being like a full form design company.
yeah,
But I guess that's what happened. Like it's
yeah.
crazy to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I remember back in the day, that was another thing that people would do is like, yeah, like pre-Instagram and Pinterest and like all of that, you would have specific designers that had Tumblrs, but then their Tumblr was just like a mood board. Like
Mhm.
they would just post photos of just things that like were within their like brand aesthetic, whatever kind of vibe. So you would like find these like tastemakers and just follow them. And like, again, they weren't making money or doing anything out of it. It was just, hey, I'm just going to keep having a running mood board that
Yeah.
where I'm going to post not my work, but other people's work and share it that way.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's like wild to think about.
Yeah.
And of course, these things are not like no one is indexing these things or talking about them. I think niche communities are doing that work now to like historicize that
Yeah.
transition. But like, there no design class is like really going in depth about the 90s and early 2000s and how that culture kind of like developed into our contemporary state of being. It honestly feels kind of like you were born into an era and then like whatever social media sites your friends are using are the ones that you use and then you don't do any thinking whatsoever
Yeah.
about other social media sites or they're viewed as like lame or boring or for older generations and they're completely cast aside.
Yeah.
And I think that's damaging in the sense that like you don't have a like cultural um timeline that everyone has access to. Like no one fully like I'm completely disconnected with like a lot younger generations because they're getting their information from other resources and that has kind of like changed the way that people interact.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's crazy that I learned Photoshop reading a book. Like I
Yeah.
literally had books that I read that were like, Photoshop fundamentals, blah blah blah. And I'm just like flipping through and like that was what I did. And then eventually once I like had the internet and like there were like actually people publishing like guides and tutorials and stuff like that, then I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that now. And then eventually, and this was like I remember when this wasn't a thing. Like there was a time where YouTube didn't have, design tutorials on it.
Yeah.
Like no one was like trying to teach people Photoshop on YouTube. Like that just wasn't a thing. Like that
Yeah.
was when YouTube was like Vine, it was just like stupid videos and like that's all it was.
Yeah.
Uh, and now it's like, wait, now there's this huge community of people that publish all this like design learning content, on Instagram, on YouTube, and then even like now they sell like their own course and like they have a whole thing and like you can do all of those things just within that space.
Yeah. Do
Yeah,
you
I don't
think,
know. It's
because I guess you learned all of your design stuff like with computers, but like not as the internet was as developed as it is now. So it's like a little bit of a different trajectory than people who are learning to do this stuff on paste up boards like before the advent of the computer. But do you think like your sort of trajectory through the kind of like rapidly increasing forms of technology and like these like the way these communities have shifted, like do you think that's influenced your work specifically or just how you kind of like relate to other designers?
I think it's interesting, right? I think I'm not sure if this actually answers the question, but this one thing I have thought about a lot is like, if I was starting over as a designer today, like
Right.
what would I do? And like what would that look like? Right. And I look back on like how long it took me to like really understand very specific, like fundamental kind of things. And like it like I had like I maybe just like poked around and just messed around with designing things for maybe like 5 years, we'll call it, right? And in those 5 years, like I could probably learn what I learned in those 5 years now in like a year, you
Yeah.
know? And like that to me is kind of wild that like we have gotten into a place where again things are so like we've kind of like figured it out. Like back then it was like we don't know what we're doing and things are weird and like, you know, whatever. And I think people generally speaking too were just trying to barely understand like what design meant in that kind of digital sense. Like what does design look like on a website versus like something that's like a billboard or like a print magazine ad or something like that. Because again, I think that's more where I started, right? It was more on that print design kind of thing. It's like I
Yeah.
see a cool ad, I want to learn how to recreate that. Um, and then it slowly turned into that like iPhone era of okay, how do we now make like cool looking like apps on your phone, or how do we make like a cool mobile website? Because you know there was a time I remember before mobile websites were a thing, right?
Yeah.
And like that's still something that needs to be designed. Um,
Right.
yeah, I don't know. It is interesting. I think things did probably take longer to learn because it was harder to get to those communities and harder to get to those resources, or like you needed to be going to design school or doing something like that. You know, that became the community, right?
Right.
And obviously, like when I started, I was, you know, I was in like middle school, you know, like that's when I really started doing all this stuff. So obviously I was just in school doing that versus like I think this traditional route of like you get through high school and then you like maybe take a couple graphic design classes here and there, which I definitely did. And then you know you get into your art school or you get into your design school and you do that, right? Um, yeah, and I think yeah, that's definitely probably made a mark for me too, is just because I started so young and just did it for fun and not for money, like it was a much different way of approaching how to learn. Um, but I think I've learned a lot of good stuff out of that too, because I think that gave me like the confidence to be able to just fail and just mess around and just like, oh, I followed the tutorial, but it looks nothing like it. I probably messed up. It's fine. I'll just come back to it later, you know? Versus I think maybe what I felt more in school when I was taking like design classes where it was like, oh, I really want to make sure I do this right. You
Yeah.
know, it was more about getting it done right versus just like having fun with it.
How did you sort of transition from doing design on the side as like a fun hobby and like personal interest to where you are now, where you like run your own company and you have a million years of experience under your belt? Like
Yeah.
it feels like a crazy sort of arc.
So I think it almost kind of happened out of like necessity,
Mm.
which is weird to reflect on. I think the first like paid client kind of work and stuff that I had actually was like in 2008-ish, like shortly after like the recession and like all of that, you know. So for me, it was like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, do like I just happen to have someone that was like, hey, can you like design me a brochure? Like those like a threefold brochure, because that was the thing, right?
Yeah.
And like a business card and like maybe a website, because that's the thing, right? We need to have a website, right? And I was like, yeah, let's do that. Because I was like, I might as well do that because I don't want to like bug my parents for money or whatever it is and
Yeah.
like do that. If anything, me making my own money would probably be good. So I guess I started doing that then. And I just kept doing it. Like I just kept realizing that like, wait, wow, this is crazy. Like I can make someone a business card and they'll give me like 200 bucks. Like as like you know, a kid in school kid,
Yeah.
you know, like that was just like wild to me that
Yeah.
like people would pay you for this thing that I was doing for fun.
Yeah.
So it just continued being this thing where I was like, anytime someone was like, hey, like I need this thing, and I'm like, oh yeah, I can help you out if you want. And I think that's always the approach I've taken is like, hey, you need help with this thing. I'm happy to help. And let's like figure this thing out. And I think I kept doing that again, like on the side, you know, through high school into undergrad. And I think eventually I got to a point where I was doing, I was doing school, I was freelancing on the side, and I did like actually I took a break from school, did the startup, and then once I finished up doing the startup thing, I was like, I basically had someone that was like, "Hey, I know you're still not done with school yet, but I'm willing to hire you full time to do this thing." And I'm like, that's kind of crazy. Maybe I should do that. That sounds great. So I just like took the job
Yeah.
just to see like how it would go because I was already taking a break from school. And next thing you know, I'm like basically rebranding a music festival. And I'm like, what is going on? How did I get here? You
Yeah.
know? So I think I took the right like risks, I guess, early on, but I also was happened to be in the right place at the right time and said yes to the right things.
Got it.
Um, so I think that was like the transition from again the freelance for fun on the side to like, okay, this is like actually my career now, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
You did a college dropout before it was cool kind of pipeline, which is
Yeah.
crazy. But you'd been basically what you're saying is that when you were in college, you had like 5 to 10 years of experience playing with this stuff for fun already. So you like already knew the stuff that you were doing and interested in.
Yeah, but I think there is definitely doing it as a freelancer on your own and doing it for like a client, like an individual, like that is one experience that you can have as a designer, right? But then also having this other experience, which I had no experience of that, which is working at a place full time with the team, with like a CEO that has specific things that he wants and like, this, marketing team that wants their other things. And like that was a completely different world that I had no idea what I was like walking myself into.
Yeah.
All I knew was that they needed a logo and they needed a this and they needed some typography and some colors and some illustrations. And I was like, let's do it. I got you. I'm your man.
Was that a particularly stressful transition or did it end up like fine? Like I would be sort of terrified taking those
I,
next steps without knowing anything.
I think, I don't know. I think maybe I didn't even realize how big of a thing I was like taking on.
Got it.
Because for me, I was like, yeah, like this is easy. Like I can make you a logo, no problem. Like, yeah, it'll take me like 2 weeks. It'll be easy. And then I'm like, oh wait, this is a lot easier when there's only like one person I have to talk to. And now I'm talking to like seven people and like have to collaborate with like this other creative director and like this person working on the sales side. And, like it just became more of like me learning all like the people skills, I guess, that are involved with design and like knowing how to like understand what people want and like try to like again capture that feeling or essence and then make it a visual thing and be like, hey, look, we did it. And like, I think this is hopefully gonna, be good for the customers that are gonna be coming to this music festival, but then also the, like the stakeholders, like the people that are actually here.
Yeah.
So again, I didn't have any of these like fancy corporate whatever kind of words back then. All I knew was like, we just gotta make sure everyone's happy and the design looks sick. Like that's all I cared about. And like I think having those two things in mind I think helped me stay focused and just get the job done kind of thing.
So
And I think I was lucky enough too that I had like again other people who were way more experienced that were basically like, this kid's good. Let's like help him in the best ways we can.
yeah. So
Yeah.
now as someone who is more experienced, what sort of advice, and it could be short, like do you have for younger people starting out now in a totally different like landscape where you can learn all the skills pretty much overnight on YouTube? Like I guess you already started talking about what you would do differently if you were starting out today, but like
Yeah.
what sagely wisdom do you have to impart on people?
Well, I guess that all depends on, like where do you want to work and like what kind of work do you want to do and like who do you want to work with, right? I think those questions are the things that I didn't have answers to back then.
Right.
And I would, tell people, hey, like, let's figure those things out first.
Mm,
Like what kind of teams do you want to work on? And like what kind of work do you want to do? And like what's the pace of the work? And those things. And again, you usually like don't know what those things are because you haven't done anything yet. So you don't
right.
know like what that looks like or what that could be. But I think if I had known again like more of what that is, I think I would have gotten to the place that I wanted to go faster,
Mm,
and met the right people and started doing more of the work that I wanted to do and all of that. And I think how do I say this? Like once you know what that is, you know, like once you've done a little bit of that reflection and like maybe thought about like, oh, when I was in school, I really liked working on these projects, or like I liked working in this kind of way, you know, then it becomes a lot easier because then you can just look for those jobs or look for those spaces where you can work in that way. I think it took me a really long time to realize that for me personally, like I do best in like the space that I'm in now, which is like me kind of running my own team, or me like acting as the person that's kind of like bringing things together to like make this final product, you know, like come to life. I think like one of the best compliments I ever got, like again earlier in that at that job at the festival, right, was um someone was like, "Oh, LaShawn, thank you for being like the glue that held the team together." I was like, "Oh, thank you. That's like really kind and sweet for you to say that." And now I recognize like that's kind of like that's where I feel the best, is where I'm able to use design as the thing that does that for the team, right? Is like we're able to like talk, you know, about things in the right way and make sure that like marketing and sales and everyone is like happy with, you know, what we're producing, and being that glue. Like I found that role for myself, and now I'm just trying to find more and more opportunities where I can continue being that for the teams I work with or the clients I work with or whatever that looks like.
That's
Does that
amazing
make sense?
advice. Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with your personality and your interests and like the kinds of projects you're interested in pursuing, and like totally like other people very different interests and niches. I think we're gonna get kicked off soon, but I wanted to thank you and Cilantro, your guest star, for all of your advice. And do you have any sort of like final remarks on your journey or other people's journeys that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, um, I mean, this is just something that's been top of mind for me lately. It's just getting started is probably the most important thing, right? So if you have a thing and you want to do it, just get started. Just
Okay.
do it, and then you know chip at it every day or every week or whatever it is, and you know next thing you know, it's going to be a year later or 5 years later, or in my case, you know, 15 whatever years later, and I'm just like, oh, I actually am living my dream and doing exactly what I set out to do,
Well,
right?
well, that's wonderful to hear as my second guest star on my series here. So thank you so much. And it's been a wonderful interview.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie.